I had to go back and play a little Chrono Trigger just to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me about the obvious similarities between that classic RPG and Sea of Stars. This brand new yet old school game doesn't present nearly as much time hopping or world traveling as its clearest inspiration, but its seafaring adventure still has plenty of twists and turns that fill up a solid 30 hours of linear spelunking. Rich and often funny character-driven stories wrap up with surprising twists that give weight to the story and provide a reason for its visually wild and mechanically interesting boss fights. At the same time, there's just not that much depth to its combat options, and its 16-bit graphics generally satisfy nostalgic cravings rather than inspiring shock and awe all over again. By its name alone, Sea of Stars may immediately sound like a generic knockoff of its forebears. The opening scenes present a story about two teenage protagonists who set off to save the world by skipping over to a neighboring island to kill off the big bad once and for all. Fortunately, saving the world is never so simple, and the story's true form begins to take shape before too long. The brilliance of this is how many times it twists and turns in a completely unexpected direction before the real ending. And I'm pleased by how it all unfolds into a story about the importance of each individual in a greater, sea. Anyway, it conveys the story competently without front-loading too much exposition after letting you loose within its first hour or so. I'm impressed by how it introduces its villains, magic, and the stakes of its world organically. And if you want to know more, you can simply return to camp and speak to the traveling bard to hear them recount the stories about the world and its denizens that took place there. Speaking of progression, Sea of Stars excels in its level design. This map is split up into islands that are navigated in an overworld that connects different zones with no combat between them, much like in the classic Chrono Trigger. But once you get into a zone, there are often tons of combat encounters and puzzles that fill up the space between larger story moments and boss battles. And most of them feel like a well-balanced challenge, rather than something that you have to grind to overcome. There's an admirable amount of variety. One particularly cool zone had me tumbling down a series of cascading waterfalls adorned by gorgeous plants and flowers. It all did a fantastic job of sucking me in and not letting go, much like the RPGs that inspired it. The puzzles are simple, but often require a decent amount of thought. Sea of Stars also makes great use of day-night mechanics, often requiring you to shift the time of day with the shoulder buttons to shine daylight or moonlight on special nodes that unlock parts of the map. Our decently written, albeit occasionally overly talkative protagonists, Zale and Valere, are solstice warriors who represent the summer and winter, giving them their special powers. Zale is a blade dancer attuned to the fire magic of the sun, whereas Valere is a lunar monk attuned to the ice magic of the moon. It's cool that this world's NPCs respond to your actions and your growing power as literal superheroes. Sea of Stars has a ship, but you won't spend too much time sailing around since it mostly just serves to connect major points of interest between story events. But I'm especially impressed by how the protagonist's powers are represented in combat. While facing a few of the campaign's biggest bosses and their minions, Zale and Valere are often the only two party members capable of dealing damage with their basic attacks and spells. This frustrated me at first, but as the campaign went on, I began to understand its pivotal lock pattern mechanic. Battles are fully turn-based, but enemies liven things up by telegraphing their upcoming attacks in patterns that can be broken with attacks of specific types. For instance, you can interrupt an enemy powering up a spell by hitting them 3 times with fire attacks, breaking their concentration, and staggering them until their next move. Later on, these patterns grow even more complex and require a mix of attacks from your teammates. And it's interesting how the other available party members do contribute to these fights even without the same damage output. This often lends their unique fighting styles to group combos that can inflict multiple types of damage and break certain locks after the combo bar is powered up through regular attacks. This momentum is helped along by basic attacks that restore MP and can potentially release bubbles of live mana that your active party member can absorb to add potency to the next move. Each party member also gets their own unique ultimate move, which functions similarly to summons in a Final Fantasy game, showing a cool cinematic before dealing a massive amount of damage. Luckily, these moves aren't exploitable since they rely on their own gauge that builds up over the course of battles. It's great that you can affect the flow of combat by pressing a button to critical hit, critical heal, or block an incoming attack as it lands. I found it satisfying that most later battles required me to hit these boosts consistently in order to feel fair. but their reaction window is frustratingly short, and without using a special relic that shoots a flare each time you land a boost, it's not always clear exactly when you're supposed to respond. That's especially hard to pin down when each animation has a different point of impact. For instance, one character jumps around before landing their strike on an enemy, and it's easy to tap too soon or too late unless you memorize the whole thing. But it's still extremely satisfying to pull off certain moves that require you to react to these finicky windows. Overall though, I'm disappointed Sea of Stars' combat system doesn't get much deeper than that. With only 6 potential teammates to play with, and only a few skills and combos total, I found myself running through the same strategies over and over by the end. Often, the most fun part of progression was getting better at precise timing. The campaign wraps up just before the limited combat options overstayed their welcome, but I'd have liked a few more spells or combos per character to master. In its favor, there's a lot of strong nostalgia vibes here. I grew up playing the 16-bit SNES, Game Boy Advance, and PlayStation 1 classics, essentially the good old days of RPGs, and Sea of Stars hits all the right notes to make me long for those good old times. Its zones are varied and colorful, featuring emotive soundtracks composed by none other than Yasunori Mitsuda and Rainbow Dragon Eyes. The former produced the soundtracks for Chrono Trigger and Xenogears, to name a few, and his unique style brings back memories of those old games. Each area exudes a unique personality thanks to catchy tunes that masterfully capture their essence. I only wish there were more ways to customize my party's playstyle, given that each character only has a few pieces of equipment available to them. Unique accessories are sparse, and those that we have lack much oomph. This means there's even less customization than there is in Final Fantasy XVI, and that can make the RPG elements of Sea of Stars feel weaker for anybody who doesn't find themselves invested in the story. Sea of Stars is an excellent tribute RPG that channels the best parts of its 90s era forebears like Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, and even, dare I say, Star Ocean: The Second Story. Because of that, it's fair to say that its world's graphical style and mechanics aren't wholly original, but there are enough interesting twists in its 30-hour story to make for a rich and enjoyable experience of its own merit. This isn't just nostalgia fodder. That said, its twitchy combat can be difficult to get a handle on. And once you do, it only stays interesting for so long before its limited customization options make it start to feel just a little repetitive. That's made up for by a strong soundtrack, an approachable and endearing story, and a wide number of fun zones and boss fights that make this a trip worth taking. For more great RPGs, check out our reviews of Baldur's Gate 3 and Dragon Alliance 3, and for everything else, stick with IGN.